July 13, 1943, 0637 hours, Mid-Atlantic Ocean. 760 miles from the nearest coastline. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer pushed his Wildcat fighter into a screaming dive from 8,000 feet. Below him, a massive German submarine sat fat and exposed on the surface, fuel hoses stretched between her hull, and 3 waiting attack boats, like an umbilical cord, connecting predators to their mother. Brewer's thumb pressed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously, stitching a line of fire across U-487's conning tower. Men screamed. Bodies flew into the ocean. And then the Avenger roared in low from the port quarter, dropping 4 depth charges in a perfect straddle that lifted the 1,600-ton submarine partially out of the water like a toy thrown by an angry child. In 30 seconds, the most feared weapon in Adolf Hitler's naval arsenal had been turned into a coffin. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we continue uncovering the most gripping stories, pivotal events, and inspiring moments from history. Your support means everything to us, and trust me, what's coming next will blow your mind. Here is the number that should make your jaw drop: 53. That is how many German U-boats were destroyed by escort carrier ships that Germany's top admirals didn't even know existed. Ships built not in years, but in weeks. Ships designed not by naval architects, but adapted from oil tankers and merchant hulls by a California construction magnate who had never built a warship in his life. Ships crewed not by professional sailors, but by college students, farmers, auto mechanics, and welders who had been civilians less than 2 years before they went hunting submarines. 53 submarines, 2,000 German sailors killed. An entire strategic offensive that had nearly strangled Britain into surrender, dismantled systematically by converted cargo ships, carrying obsolete aircraft flown by reserve pilots who had no business being anywhere near a combat zone. This is their story. But to understand how extraordinary this was, you first need to understand exactly how desperate the situation had become. Because by early 1943, Germany was winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Not just winning, dominating it in a way that kept Winston Churchill awake every single night, staring at the ceiling of his war room, running numbers in his head that all pointed toward the same conclusion: Britain was going to starve. The numbers in 1942 were apocalyptic. German U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in a single year. 6 million tons. That is roughly 1,500 ships, cargo vessels, tankers, troop transports, dragged to the bottom of the Atlantic, carrying food, fuel, weapons, and men. The Germans were sinking ships faster than American and British shipyards combined could build replacements. Faster than Britain could replace the oil being lost. Faster than the math could work out in anyone's favor except Adolf Hitler's. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of Germany's U-boat force, had done the calculations himself. He knew exactly what he needed: 300 operational submarines working simultaneously in the Atlantic. At that threshold, the math was merciless. Britain's import capacity would collapse. Her factories would go dark. Her population would face genuine famine. And without Britain as a base of operations, the entire American strategy of fighting Germany in Europe would become logistically impossible. The war in the West would effectively be over. And by early 1943, Dönitz had his 300 submarines. He had his Wolfpacks groups of 6 to 12 U-boats coordinated by radio to converge on convoys from multiple directions, simultaneously attacking at night on the surface, when escort destroyers' sonar was nearly blind, overwhelming convoy defenses through sheer numbers and speed. The tactics had been developed through years of bitter experience, refined through hundreds of engagements, and executed by commanders with thousands of hours of combat experience. Against these men and their machines, the Allies had tried everything. They had tried convoy escorts, destroyers, racing along the perimeter of merchant ship formations, but there were never enough of them, and U-boats simply dove beneath the surface to wait for the escorts to pass. They had tried long-range patrol aircraft operating from Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, But between these land bases stretched an enormous void in the central Atlantic, a zone 600 miles wide that no land-based aircraft could reach. The Germans called it the Black Pit, the air gap, the place where U-boats could operate completely freely, surfacing in broad daylight to recharge batteries, coordinate attacks, and refuel from the massive Type 14 supply submarines, the milch cows that Donitz had positioned like floating gas stations in the mid-ocean emptiness. In March 1943 alone, U-boats sank 97 Allied ships, 97 vessels in 31 days, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies gone, thousands of sailors killed. The British Admiralty issued an internal assessment that used language unprecedented in its starkness. The Battle of the Atlantic might already be lost. But no one told Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser was 61 years old in 1942, and he had spent his entire career building things that other people said were impossible. He had helped build the Hoover Dam. He had built the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. He had built the Grand Coulee Dam. He had never built a ship in his life, which apparently did not bother him at all, because in 1940 he had looked at the contracts being offered by the British government for cargo vessels and decided that his construction methods, prefabrication welding, instead of riveting assembly line production, could be applied to ships just as easily as to concrete. He was right. Kaiser's shipyards in Richmond, California, and Vancouver, Washington, began producing Liberty ships at a rate that made naval architects physically uncomfortable. The first Liberty ship built using traditional methods required 244 days to construct. Kaiser's yards cut that to an average of 41 days, then 30. Then, in a publicity stunt that stunned the world, they launched a single Liberty ship from Kiel, laying to completion in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. But Henry Kaiser had a bigger idea. A dangerous idea. An idea that when he first proposed it to the United States Navy in late 1941 was greeted with the kind of polite professional skepticism that men in uniform reserve for civilians who don't understand how things work. Kaiser wanted to convert his merchant ship hulls into aircraft carriers, while not real aircraft carriers. Not the massive 27,000-ton fleet carriers that the Navy spent 2 years building and assigned to battle fleet operations. Something smaller. Something simpler. Something that could be produced in his shipyards in weeks rather than years using the same prefabricated sections and welding techniques he was already applying to Liberty ships. Escort carriers. Tiny, slow, unglamorous vessels with a flight deck barely long enough for a loaded Avenger torpedo bomber to get airborne. Ships that the professional Navy looked at and saw everything they weren't. Not fast enough, not big enough, not armored enough, not dignified enough for serious naval combat. The official term for them was CVE, Carrier Vessel Escort. The sailors who served on them had other names. Combustible, vulnerable, expendable. Kaiser's coffins, banana boats. The names were not entirely affectionate. The Navy's objections were both numerous and reasonable. Escort carriers would be too slow to maneuver effectively. Their maximum speed of 19 knots barely exceeded the surface speed of the U-boats they were supposed to hunt. Their flight decks were so short that only the most experienced pilots could operate from them safely, and most of the pilots available in 1942 were anything but experienced. Their thin hulls offered no protection against torpedoes or bombs, and their aircraft-aging F-4F Wildcats and TBF Avengers were not cutting-edge combat aircraft by any standard. More fundamentally, the professional naval establishment could not conceptually accept the idea of using aircraft carriers to hunt submarines. Carriers were capital ships, the most valuable and prestigious vessels in any fleet. You used them to project power to fight fleet actions to support amphibious landings. You did not send them wandering around the Atlantic chasing submarines like a terrier hunting rats. That was beneath them. That was a waste. What the professional Navy was missing, what Kaiser understood instinctively from his background in mass production and construction, was that the escort carrier's weakness was also its greatest strength. Because if you could build them fast enough, cheap enough, and in large enough numbers, it did not matter if you lost one. You simply built another. And while you were building another, the ones already in service were hunting. Kaiser promised President Roosevelt 50 carriers in 12 months. The naval officers in the room at that meeting exchanged glances that said everything without saying a word. This man had no idea what he was talking about. Kaiser delivered 50 carriers in 12 months. Then he built 28 more. The Casablanca-class escort carrier that Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard began producing in mid-1942 displaced 8,000 tons, measured 512 feet from bow to stern, and carried 28 aircraft. From keel, laying to commissioning took an average of less than 3 months. By comparison, a German submarine, the primary weapon Kaiser's carriers were designed to destroy, took an average of 6 months to build and required vastly more skilled labor and specialized materials. The arithmetic of industrial warfare is cold and simple. If you can build your countermeasure faster than the enemy can build his weapon, you win. Not elegantly, not through tactical genius or superior training or professional excellence. Through production. Through the relentless application of industrial capacity to military problems. But a ship is nothing without its crew. And the crew of USS Core CVE-13, one of the first Casablanca-class carriers commissioned in 1943, was a perfect example of what America's mobilization had produced. Captain Arnold Isbell, who commanded Corps' hunter-killer group in the summer of 1943, was a regular Navy officer. But below him, the 860 men who operated the carrier, maintained her aircraft, and flew her missions were overwhelmingly reservists. Men who had been in insurance and farming, in auto repair in college classrooms 18 months before they reported for duty. The pilots of Composite Squadron 13, the air group assigned to Corps, had an average of less than 200 flight hours when they first deployed. 200 hours. The German U-boat commanders they were hunting had years of combat experience. Some of them had been operating submarines since 1939. They knew every evasion technique, every survival trick, every vulnerability in Allied anti-submarine doctrine. What the German commanders did not know, what their intelligence services had completely failed to detect, was that the world had changed beneath their feet while they were busy winning. The escort carriers carried two technologies that transformed the balance of power in the Atlantic overnight. The first was centimetric radar, a new type of radar operating at wavelengths so short that German submarines' electronic detection equipment, designed to warn them of incoming radar signals, simply could not receive it. A U-boat skipper, relying on his radar detector to give him warning of approaching aircraft, would pick up nothing, hear nothing, see nothing, until the aircraft was already in its attack dive less than 4 miles away. And it was too late to do anything but order his crew to brace for impact. The second technology was the Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo codenamed Fido, nicknamed Fido, officially listed in Navy documents as a mine to maintain secrecy. Dropped from an aircraft near a diving submarine. Fido homed in on the sound of the submarine's propellers, tracking its target relentlessly through evasive maneuvers, through crash dives, through every technique German commanders had developed over years of surviving depth charge attacks. There was no counter to Fido. You could not turn fast enough to escape it. You could not dive deep enough to lose it. It simply followed you until it hit. German submarine commanders who survived Fido attacks described torpedoes that seemed to chase them underwater. Their reports were so bizarre that Donitz's intelligence staff initially dismissed them. Weapons that turned when the submarine turned. Weapons that followed crash dives. Weapons that tracked survivors through the darkened ocean like something from a nightmare. The technology was so secret that even most American naval officers didn't know it existed. The Germans wouldn't understand what was killing their submarines until the war was nearly over. Now all of this, the escorts, the radar, the homing torpedo, the Kaiser-built carriers, the reserve pilots, the converted hulls converged on a single point in the South Atlantic in the summer of 1943. And what happened there would break the back of the most feared submarine force in history. On July 13, 1943, U-487 was not expecting visitors. Her commander, Oberleutnant Herbert Metz, had calculated his position with precision. 100 miles from the nearest Allied airbase, beyond the range of any land-based aircraft, in the heart of the Black Pit, perfectly safe. What Herbert Metz could not know, was that USS Escort was operating 150 miles to his northeast. That Corps' aircraft had been tracking decoded German radio transmissions for 3 days. That at 402 aircraft from Composite Squadron 13 had launched from Corps' pitching deck in pre-dawn darkness, climbing into the Atlantic sky and beginning a search pattern that would bring them directly overhead in less than 3 hours. His lookouts spotted the aircraft at 4 miles. By then, Brewer's Wildcat was already in its gun run. The depth charges that bracketed U-487's hull at 0637 were not enough to finish her. Somehow, Herbert Metz got his damaged submarine below the surface. Somehow, he bought himself 38 minutes. 38 minutes at the bottom of the ocean, while American pilots circled above calling for reinforcements, dropping sonobuoys, tracking his every move through the water. At 0715, Lieutenant Robert Williams arrived with a second Wildcat Avenger team. Williams's Avenger dropped a single Mark 24 Fido into the oil slick marking where U-487 had submerged. The torpedo entered the water, found the sound of U-487's desperate propellers, and tracked her down through the dark Atlantic. The explosion broke U-487's pressure hull. All 58 men aboard went down with her. It was the first of 3 submarines that Corps' aircraft would destroy that day, and it was only July. Battle. The summer of 1943 was about to become the most catastrophic season in the history of German naval warfare. Donitz would call it Black May, though the slaughter extended through June and July and beyond. His submarines were disappearing in waters that should have been perfectly safe, attacked by aircraft that appeared from nowhere, killed by weapons that defied everything his commanders understood about anti-submarine warfare. His intelligence staff had no answers. His technical experts had no solutions. His submarine commanders had no warning. Because the answer was sitting on the surface of the Atlantic, moving at 19 knots, built in 10 weeks by a man who had never built a ship in his life, crewed by college students who had never been to sea. By the time Donitz finally understood what was hunting his submarines, it was already too late. 53 U-boats were already gone. Hundreds of their crews were already dead. And the Battle of the Atlantic, the campaign that had come within measurable distance of defeating Britain entirely, had already been lost. But in the summer of 1943, as USS Core, USS Card, and USS Bogue fanned out across the Atlantic with their hunter-killer groups, the full scope of what was happening was only beginning to reveal itself. Because destroying a submarine in the mid-Atlantic was one thing. What came next, the systematic, methodical, total dismantling of Germany's entire submarine offensive, required something more. Something that even the men doing it did not fully understand they were capable of. In Part 2, we will follow the hunters into the Black Pit itself, where 6 escort carriers begin operating simultaneously, closing every gap, covering every escape route, hunting the milch cow supply submarines one by one until the entire German submarine offensive in the Atlantic collapses from within. And we will meet the German commanders who finally understood what was happening to them and were powerless to stop it. In Part 1, we watched USS Corps' aircraft tear apart U-487 in the middle of the Atlantic, a submarine operating in waters that Germany's top admirals had personally guaranteed were untouchable. 3 submarines destroyed in a single day, 58 German sailors dead before noon. And the man responsible wasn't an admiral. He wasn't a career naval officer with decades of sea experience. He was a construction magnate from California who had never built a warship in his life, whose escort carriers the professional Navy had dismissed as Kaiser's coffins, too slow, too small, too cheap to matter. But here is what nobody was saying out loud in the summer of 1943. The escort carriers were working. And the German Navy had absolutely no idea why their submarines were dying. What Donitz didn't know would fill a book. What the United States Navy knew and refused to fully act on nearly cost them everything. Because while Kaiser's shipyards were welding escort carrier hulls together at a rate that defied comprehension, a war was happening inside the Navy itself. A war fought not with depth charges and torpedoes, but with memoranda rank and the particular arrogance of men who had spent 30 years learning how naval warfare worked and could not accept that someone had rewritten the rules without asking their permission. Rear Admiral Royal Ingersoll had been in the United States Navy since 1905. He had served in 2 world wars. He had commanded destroyers, cruisers, and fleet operations across 3 oceans. When he looked at an escort carrier, he saw liability. A slow, thin-skinned, underarmed vessel that could be sunk by a single torpedo, operated by reserve pilots who had more enthusiasm than skill, assigned to a mission-independent submarine hunting that violated every principle of sound naval strategy he had absorbed over 4 decades. These ships, Ingersoll told a planning meeting in Washington in the spring of 1943, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never seriously been wrong. Our convoy escorts, they protect merchant ships. They do not go hunting independently in open ocean. That is not what they were designed for. That is not what they are capable of. Captain Gallery. Daniel V. Gallery, the aggressive, unconventional officer who had been arguing for independent hunter-killer operations since the first escort carriers were commissioned, sat across the table and kept his expression neutral. He had learned that losing his temper in these meetings lost him ground. "Admiral," he said carefully, "we have intelligence on milch cow positions updated within 48 hours. We know exactly where their supply submarines are operating. If we send carrier groups directly to those positions, you are proposing to detach fleet assets from convoy protection," Ingersoll interrupted. "Based on intelligence that may or may not be accurate to hunt submarines, that may or may not be where your intelligence claims in mid-ocean positions, where if your carrier is damaged, you have no support within 600 miles. He paused. "That is not a strategy, Captain. That is gambling." Gallery looked at the chart on the table between them. In March, U-boats had sunk 97 Allied ships. In April, the number had dropped slightly, but only because weather had reduced submarine operations, not because Allied defenses had improved. The milch cows. The Type 14 supply submarines were the engine of the entire German offensive. Each one could refuel 12 attack submarines per patrol, extending their range by weeks, multiplying their effective striking power across the entire Atlantic. There were 10 of them operating. If those 10 submarines were destroyed, the entire German Wolfpack strategy in distant waters collapsed from fuel starvation alone. Gallery knew this. His intelligence officers knew this. The decoded German radio traffic ultra-intelligence so secret that its existence was known to fewer than 100 Americans made the milch cow positions almost as readable as a newspaper. And Ingersoll was telling him to use his carriers to escort merchant ships instead. "Sir Bum," Gallery said, and his voice was quiet now, the quietness of a man exercising enormous self-control. "If we don't kill the milch cows, we don't win this battle. We manage it, we survive it, but we don't win it. And right now we know where they are." Ingersoll looked at him for a long moment. "Dismissed, Captain." Gallery was 3 days away from having his request formally denied and his carrier group reassigned to North Atlantic convoy escort duty when Admiral Ernest King intervened. King was Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, the most powerful naval officer in America, famously difficult, famously brilliant, famously unwilling to accept answers he didn't believe. King had been watching the Atlantic situation with the cold attention of a man who counted ships and bodies and understood exactly what the numbers meant. He had also been reading the Ultra Intercepts personally. He knew where the milch cows were. King called Gallery into his office on a Tuesday morning in May 1943. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. When Gallery walked out, he had authorization for independent hunter-killer operations using escort carrier groups' direct intelligence support from 10th Fleet headquarters in Washington, and a mandate that cut through Ingersoll's objections like a knife find the supply submarines and destroy them. He also had a condition: 1 deployment, 90 days, measurable results. If the hunter-killer concept didn't prove itself in combat within 3 months, the carriers went back to convoy escort, and the experiment ended permanently. 90 days to prove that Kaiser's coffins could win the Battle of the Atlantic. USS Escort deployed from Norfolk on June 27, 1943, with her hunter-killer group, 4 destroyer escorts, and 28 aircraft. Captain Arnold Isbell commanding. His pilots had been briefed on the Ultra Intelligence. A Type 14, Milch Cow U-487, was operating 760 miles southwest of the Azores, scheduled to rendezvous with 3 attack submarines on July 13th. Isbell moved his carrier group into position over 5 days of careful maneuvering, maintaining radio silence, staying below the horizon from any possible German observation, closing the distance to his target with the patience of a man who knew he had exactly one chance. The morning of July 13th was overcast. The Atlantic was running moderate swells, not rough enough to ground aircraft, but rough enough to make deck operations genuinely dangerous. At 0400 Isbell launched his first search pair into the pre-dawn darkness, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, in a Wildcat fighter. Lieutenant Junior, Grade Earl Steiger, in a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. Standard hunter-killer combination. The fighter to suppress anti-aircraft fire, the Avenger to deliver the killing blow. At 6:37, Brewer's radar painted a surface contact at 15 miles. He called it in. He pushed his Wildcat into a dive. And what happened in the next 90 seconds changed the Battle of the Atlantic permanently. The depth charges from Steiger's Avenger straddled U-487's hull. The submarine crash-dived damaged but alive. For 38 minutes, Herbert Metz drove his wounded boat through the deep Atlantic, listening to the sound of aircraft circling above, knowing they were waiting, knowing they had weapons he didn't understand, knowing that surfacing meant death, but that his batteries were bleeding power with every minute. At 07:15, Lieutenant Robert Williams arrived with the second Wildcat Avenger pair. Williams dropped a single Mark 24 Fido into the oil slick. The acoustic torpedo entered the water, found U-487's propellers, and ran her down through the darkness. The explosion broke her keel. All 58 men died. Corps' aircraft destroyed 2 more submarines before sunset. 3 U-boats gone in 1 day. But the number that mattered more than any single day's kill count was this 0. 0 Milch Cows had successfully completed their resupply missions in the mid-Atlantic that day. 0 attack submarines had received the fuel they needed to continue operations, and the German Naval Command in Berlin had received 3 distress signals from submarines reporting air attack in positions absolutely impossible for land-based aircraft to reach and then silence. Dönitz was furious, and he was confused. His technical staff told him the submarines must have been attacked by very long-range Liberator patrol aircraft operating at the extreme edge of their fuel capacity. It was the only explanation that fit their understanding of Allied capabilities. The idea that aircraft carriers' fleet assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars were being deployed independently to hunt submarines in the mid-Atlantic was so far outside their strategic framework that German intelligence literally did not consider it. But Dönitz also did something that made the coming weeks dramatically more dangerous for everyone involved. He ordered his submarines to fight back. He had been receiving reports from commanders throughout the spring that aircraft attacks were becoming more frequent, more effective, more sudden. His response was to equip his submarines with heavier anti-aircraft armament, quadruple 20mm cannons, improved 37mm guns, and to issue a standing order when attacked by aircraft. Remain surfaced and fight. Shoot them down. Make the attacks too costly to continue. The logic was sound in theory. A U-boat that dove when attacked, gave up all initiative, surrendered its ability to fight back, and spent hours recovering battery charge. It could not afford to lose. A U-boat that stayed on the surface and fought might, if its gunners were skilled and lucky, destroy enough attacking aircraft to discourage the escorts from pressing their attacks. Dönitz had done the mathematics. His submarines needed to kill 3 aircraft for every submarine saved to make the tactic economically viable. What his mathematics did not account for was coordinated attack by multiple aircraft from multiple directions, simultaneously, a tactic that Composite Squadron 9 operating from USS Bogue had spent 3 months perfecting into something close to an art form. When a Wildcat Avenger team attacked the fighter, came in first low and fast, strafing the conning tower with .50 caliber fire to kill the anti-aircraft gunners or force them to take cover. While the German crew was tracking the fighter, the Avenger came in from a different angle, at a different altitude, dropping depth charges or a FIDO before the submarine's remaining gunners could shift their weapons. U-758 encountered this tactic on August 3, 1943. Her commander, confident in his enhanced armament, ordered his gunners to their stations when aircraft from Bogue appeared. His 20mm cannons opened fire. They actually damaged the first Avenger, scored real hits, forced the pilot to break off his attack run. For approximately 15 seconds, it looked like Donitz's theory might work. Then the second Wildcat came in from the port quarter at wave-top height. Its 6 machine guns swept U-758's deck from bow to stern. Every man standing died or went down wounded in the first burst. The second Avenger, which had been holding off at 3 miles, waiting for exactly this moment, rolled into its attack run against a submarine with no one left alive to man its guns. 4 depth charges. Perfect straddle. U-758 went down in 40 seconds. 5 men survived from a crew of 48. When Isbell returned to Norfolk in October 1943, USS Card's hunter-killer group had sunk 8 submarines in 90 days. 8 U-boats. Their aircraft had flown over 1,300 operational hours. They had attacked submarines on 27 separate occasions. They had forced dozens more to remain submerged until battery exhaustion left their commanders no choice but to surface and surrender or die. Admiral King read the after-action report and then called Ingersoll. The conversation was brief. Independent hunter-killer operations were approved permanently. Additional escort carrier groups would be deployed immediately. The experiment was over. The strategy was doctrine. But as the summer turned to autumn, something was shifting in the deep water that nobody in Washington had fully anticipated. Because Dönitz, for all his mistakes, was not a man who accepted defeat without fighting back. His submarines were dying in the mid-Atlantic. His milch cows were being hunted down one by one with a precision that suggested the Allies knew exactly where to find them. The intelligence picture was becoming impossible to explain through bad luck or Allied skill alone. In October 1943, a surviving U-boat commander named Werner Henke filed a report with German Naval Command that contained a single sentence that should have sent shockwaves through Berlin. The enemy appears to know our rendezvous coordinates in advance. Dönitz read that sentence 3 times. Then he summoned his intelligence chief. Someone was breaking Enigma, and if that was true, then every U-boat in the Atlantic was already dead. They simply hadn't received the news yet. In Part 3, we follow what happens when Germany begins to suspect that their most secure communications have been compromised, and the desperate measures Dönitz takes to change his codes, shift his tactics, and find a technological answer to escort carriers that might turn the tide back before the last of his gray wolves disappear beneath the Atlantic forever. In Part 1, Henry Kaiser built the impossible escort carriers in weeks instead of years, crewed by civilians who became hunters. In Part 2, those hunters proved themselves. USS Card's group destroyed 8 U-boats in 90 days. Admiral King made independent hunter-killer operations, permanent doctrine, and a German commander named Werner Henke filed a report that shook Berlin to its foundation. The enemy knows our rendezvous coordinates in advance. Dönitz summoned his intelligence chief. The question on the table was the most dangerous question in the entire German war effort. Was Enigma broken? The answer would determine whether every submarine still at sea was already condemned. Here is the number that defined the autumn of 1943-41. In May alone, Germany lost 41 submarines, 41 crews, nearly 2,000 men. In the entire first year of the war, Germany had lost fewer than 30. The rate of destruction had not doubled or tripled. It had become geometrically catastrophically worse. And Donitz's staff, staring at the loss charts in their Berlin headquarters, could not construct a rational explanation that didn't point toward the same terrible conclusion. The Americans weren't getting lucky. They were getting information. Kapitän Leutnant Hans Joachim Schwanke, commanding U-43, surfaced on July 30, 1943, in the mid-Atlantic to collect a supply drop. The position had been communicated by encrypted radio transmission less than 24 hours earlier. When he broke, the surface aircraft from USS Santee were already overhead. His submarine was destroyed in minutes. No survivors. Schwanke had followed every security protocol correctly. His encryption had been perfect. His position should have been known only to German Naval Command. Dönitz ordered an immediate review of Enigma security. His cryptographers ran the analysis and came back with a conclusion that was simultaneously reassuring and useless. Enigma itself had not been broken. The mathematics were sound. The machine was secure. But somewhere in the chain, in the radio operators who transmitted coordinates, in the support infrastructure that communicated rendezvous points, in the administrative machinery of submarine warfare, there was a compromise. The Germans changed their naval Enigma settings, added new codebooks, modified their transmission protocols, and waited to see if the losses slowed. They didn't slow, they accelerated. What Dönitz could not know, what fewer than 200 people on Earth knew, was that Bletchley Park's codebreakers had cracked not just Enigma, but the entire German naval communication architecture. Every rendezvous point, every fuel state, every patrol route. The ultra-intelligence flowing into 10th Fleet headquarters in Washington was so complete that American staff officers sometimes knew the names of individual U-boat commanders before those commanders knew their own patrol assignments. When Dönitz changed his codes, Bletchley Park broke the new codes within days. The intelligence never stopped flowing. But while Dönitz was hunting ghosts in his own communication security, his engineers were working on something real. Something that represented Germany's genuine technological answer to the escort carrier problem. The Zaunkönig, the T-5 acoustic homing torpedo. A weapon designed specifically to hunt the destroyer escorts that protected the American carrier groups. A torpedo that homed on propeller noise, that could be fired from a submerged submarine directly at a pursuing warship, that turned the Americans' own hunter-killer tactics against them. The Germans deployed the Zaunkönig in September 1943 with enormous confidence. Dönitz personally announced to his submarine commanders that this weapon would restore the offensive capability they had lost. The destroyer escorts that had been hunting submarines with such devastating effectiveness would now become targets themselves. The hunter-killer groups that had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for U-boats would face the same sudden, unavoidable death from below that they had been delivering from above. In the first week of deployment, Zaunkönig torpedoes sank 2 Allied escort vessels and damaged 3 others. Dönitz's mood in Berlin shifted from desperate to cautiously optimistic. His commanders reported successful attacks. The new weapon was working. Then the Allies deployed CAT, the Foxer noisemaker, a simple device towed behind destroyers that generated propeller sounds louder than the ship itself, drawing acoustic torpedoes away from their targets. The entire Zaunkönig program, years of German engineering and months of production, was countered within 3 weeks by a device that cost less than $1,000 to manufacture and could be deployed by any destroyer in under an hour. The technological escalation that Dönitz had banked on to save his submarine force had been neutralized before it could achieve any strategic impact. This is when the losses inside the German submarine force began producing a crisis that no weapon could fix. Because math is merciless, and the math of the U-boat war in late 1943 pointed toward one conclusion: the submarines were dying faster than Germany could train replacements. A U-boat crew required 18 months to train from civilian to combat ready. A Casablanca-class escort carrier required less than 3 months to build. America was producing the counterweapon 6 times faster than Germany could produce the trained personnel to operate the weapon being countered. This was not a tactical problem. It was not a technological problem. It was an industrial problem, and industrial problems in 1943 had exactly one solution: the side with larger factories won. But the human cost inside the U-boat force was becoming impossible to conceal. Crews who had once competed for patrol assignments were now requesting transfers to shore duty. Commanders were filing reports that used language unprecedented in German military communication references to crews who were psychologically unfit for further Atlantic operations, to men who heard aircraft engines while submerged, who experienced what the reports clinically called air psychosis. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Rudloff, commanding U-609, wrote in his war diary that his lookouts had become so frightened that they were ordering crash dives in response to clouds. His patrol ended with 0 ships sunk after 45 days. A year earlier, a 45-day patrol that produced nothing would have been a professional catastrophe. By late 1943, coming home alive was considered a reasonable outcome. Then came June 4, 1944, and USS Guadalcanal. Captain Daniel Gallery had been hunting submarines in the Atlantic for 2 years, and he had developed a theory that his superiors considered eccentric, bordering on insubordinate. Gallery believed that capturing a U-boat intact, not sinking it, not depth charging it to the bottom, but physically boarding it and taking it as a prize, was operationally possible and strategically invaluable. A captured submarine meant captured codebooks, captured Enigma settings, captured technical documentation about every new weapon and system the Germans were developing. Intelligence worth infinitely more than another entry on the kill list. His superiors told him this was fantasy. You couldn't board a submarine in the open ocean. The crew would scuttle it before you reached the hatch. It had never been done in the modern era, and there was no reason to believe it could be done. Gallery trained his boarding parties anyway. June 4, 1944. Northeast Atlantic, approximately 150 miles northwest of Dakar. U-505, commanded by Oberleutnant Harold Lang, had been operating for 3 weeks and was running low on fuel when aircraft from USS Guadalcanal found her on the surface at 11:10 hours. The attack was immediate and overwhelming. 2 Avengers diving simultaneously. Depth charges exploding around U-505's hull. The pressure hull remained intact barely, but the explosions knocked out the submarine's diving controls. Lang, wounded on the bridge, his boat unable to submerge, ordered abandon ship and scuttling charges set. His crew went over the side. The scuttling charges were triggered. What happened next lasted 11 minutes and changed the entire intelligence picture of the Atlantic War. Gallery's boarding party, 8 men, led by Lieutenant Albert David, hit the water in a whaleboat before U-505 had fully stopped moving. They reached the submarine's hatch while the scuttling charges were still counting down. David went in first, alone, into a submarine that might explode at any moment, filled with seawater rising around his boots in complete uncertainty about whether the charges below him had been disabled or were 30 seconds from detonating. He found the charges. He pulled them. He worked by feel in a flooding compartment with the clock running and no one to tell him where anything was. The charges did not go off. Gallery's crew got a tow line on U-505 within minutes. The destroyer escorts collected 58 German survivors from the water, and USS Guadalcanal began towing an intact operational German submarine with her full codebooks, her current Enigma settings, her technical manuals, her crew's personal correspondence, everything toward the Canary Islands at 6 knots. The haul from U-505 was staggering. Current Enigma naval settings valid for the next 3 months. Technical documentation on the Zonkönig acoustic torpedo that allowed Allied engineers to develop countermeasures in weeks instead of the months blind analysis would have required. Maintenance manuals for every major system on German submarines identifying vulnerability points that anti-submarine weapons could be optimized to exploit. Personal letters from crew members that, when cross-referenced with prisoner interrogations, gave Allied intelligence a granular picture of morale collapse inside the U-boat force. The capture was kept classified for the remainder of the war. The 58 German prisoners were held in isolation, denied any male contact, to prevent word reaching German Naval Command that U-505 had been taken rather than sunk. If Donitz learned his codes were in Allied hands, he would change everything overnight. The secret held. For 11 months after U-505's capture, German submarines operated on communication protocols that Allied intelligence could read in real time, their positions transmitted to hunter-killer groups within hours of being encoded. By September 1943, the transformation in Atlantic shipping losses was measurable in numbers that would have seemed miraculous 12 months earlier. In March 1943, U-boats sank 97 Allied ships. In September, they sank 9 ships in a month, where 6 escort carrier groups were operating simultaneously, where ultra-intelligence was providing continuous targeting data, where the Milch Cow supply submarines had been reduced from 10 operational boats to 3. The Wolfpack strategy that Donitz had built his entire career around was functionally dead. His submarines could no longer find convoys, could no longer surface to achieve the speed needed to position for attack, could no longer coordinate through radio, without that radio traffic being decoded and used to vector aircraft directly to their positions. The Grey Wolves had been hunted to the edge of extinction. Germany lost 237 submarines in 1943. 237 hulls. Approximately 15,000 men. For a return of roughly 2 million tons of Allied shipping, sunk a ratio that represented complete strategic failure when American shipyards were launching Liberty ships at a rate of 1 per day. Admiral King awarded Captain Arnold Isbell the Navy Cross. Captain Gallery received the Distinguished Service Medal. The pilots of the composite squadrons, the reserve officers, the college students, the farm boys who had learned to land on pitching decks in North Atlantic gales, received commendations that filled pages. But the recognition that mattered most was not decorative. It was doctrinal. Independent hunter-killer operations became permanent, funded, and expanded. The escort carrier concept that Ingersoll had dismissed as gambling became the central instrument of Allied naval strategy in the Atlantic. Donitz issued a final assessment to German Naval Command in December 1943. His language was the language of a man who had run out of alternatives. The submarine war in the North Atlantic, he wrote, could not be continued under present conditions. His boats were being destroyed by an enemy capability that German technology could not match, and German intelligence had completely failed to anticipate. He recommended preserving the remaining submarines for operations in peripheral theaters. The Arctic, the Indian Ocean waters, where escort carriers had not yet fully deployed while awaiting the new Type 21 submarine that might eventually restore the balance. He was asking Germany to wait for a weapon that wouldn't be ready until 1945. He was asking Germany to concede the Atlantic battle that his entire strategic conception had been built around winning. And he was doing it because 60 converted merchant ships built by a man who had never built a warship crewed by civilians who had never been to sea had destroyed the most sophisticated submarine force in history. But here is the question that Part 4 will answer. The one that none of the after-action reports, none of the commendations, none of the strategic assessments address. What happened to the men who came home? To the pilots who flew 200 combat hours from pitching decks in the North Atlantic and then went back to being insurance salesmen? To the welders in Kaiser's yards who built the ships that won the battle and then went back to building bridges? And what happened to the 30,000 German sailors who didn't come home at all, whose families received telegrams that said only that their sons and husbands were missing in the Atlantic, lost in waters that Germany's admirals had promised were safe? The story of the escort carriers has a final chapter, and it is one that almost no one knows. From a California construction yard, where men had never built a warship, to the mid-Atlantic, where German submarines disappeared without explanation. From Kaiser's coffins, too slow, too cheap, too simple to matter to the systematic destruction of the most feared submarine force in history. Parts 1 through 3 traced how 53 U-boats were hunted down, how Black May became Germany's naval graveyard, how U-505 was captured intact, and her secrets bled into Allied intelligence for 11 months, without Berlin ever knowing. Donitz admitted defeat. The Atlantic was won. But here is the question nobody asked in the victory celebrations. What happened to the men who built the ships, who flew the missions, who went into a flooding submarine alone with scuttling charges counting down. And what happened to the idea itself? The crazy, embarrassing, professionally risky idea that small carriers built fast could beat submarines that had nearly starved an empire. This story has a final chapter, and it contains a truth that almost no history book records. Daniel Gallery retired from the United States Navy in 1960 as a Rear Admiral. He had commanded USS Guadalcanal, captured U-5. O-5 received the Distinguished Service Medal and spent the final years of his career writing not strategic assessments or tactical manuals but books. Readable books. Books written for ordinary Americans about what naval warfare actually felt like from the inside. He was funny, irreverent, occasionally insubordinate even in print, and completely incapable of pretending that the Navy's institutional resistance to new ideas had been anything other than what it was, a nearly catastrophic failure of imagination that cost thousands of lives in the 18 months between when escort carriers could have been deployed and when they actually were. Gallery died in 1977. He never received the recognition that his capture of U-505 arguably deserved an operation that provided more actionable intelligence about German submarine capabilities than any other single event in the Atlantic War. The official Navy history treated it as a remarkable footnote, rather than the strategic turning point it represented. Gallery seems to have understood this would happen. In his memoir, he wrote that the Navy was very good at honoring men who sank things, and considerably less enthusiastic about honoring men who captured things because capturing things required admitting that someone had thought of something the institution hadn't. Arnold Isbell, who commanded USS Card through the deployment that sank 8 submarines in 90 days and established the hunter-killer template that every subsequent escort carrier group followed, received his Navy Cross and returned to administrative duties. He retired as a Rear Admiral in 1954 and spent the rest of his life in Virginia, largely unknown outside specialist naval history circles. The men of Composite Squadron 13. The reserve pilots who had been college students and insurance salesmen 18 months before they started killing submarines went back to being college students and insurance salesmen when the war ended. Most of them never spoke publicly about what they had done, not from modesty. From the particular silence of men who had experienced something so extreme that ordinary language felt inadequate to describe it. Henry Kaiser never built another warship after 1945. His shipyards converted back to civilian production within months of the Japanese surrender, and Kaiser himself moved on to automobiles, aluminum healthcare, and a dozen other industries where he applied the same prefabrication and assembly line principles that had produced escort carriers at a rate that German naval experts considered physically impossible. He died in 1967 at 85, a celebrated industrialist, the subject of documentary films and business school case studies, most of which discussed his Kaiser Permanente healthcare system or his construction projects, and mentioned the escort carriers briefly, if at all. The ships that arguably saved Britain from starvation received roughly 1 paragraph for every 10 pages devoted to his hospital network. Rear Admiral Royal Ingersoll, the officer who told Gallery that independent hunter-killer operations were gambling, not strategy, retired with full honors in 1946. He had commanded the Atlantic Fleet from 1942 to 1944 and received credit for the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, a victory achieved substantially through tactics he had initially opposed. History has been kind to Ingersoll in the way that history is always kind to senior officers whose commands succeed, regardless of whether the success happened because of or despite their judgment. The 30,000 German sailors who died in U-boats received no kindness from history or from the Atlantic. Their families received telegrams. Some families received nothing at all. Their sons simply ceased to exist. Their submarines unlocated at the bottom of an ocean that covered the evidence completely. Wolfgang Luth, the U-boat ace, who after the war stated that escort carriers had hunted his force to extinction, survived the war, only to be shot accidentally by a German sentry in May 1945, 3 days before the surrender. He was 31 years old. He had spent 8 years at sea and survived everything the Atlantic could produce, and died in a case of mistaken identity in the final hours of a war already lost. And the technology the escort carriers introduced did not retire with the ships. It evolved into something that now covers every ocean on Earth every day without pause. The acoustic homing torpedo, FIDO. The weapon that chased submarines through crash dives and evasive maneuvers became the foundation of every subsequent naval acoustic weapon system. Modern lightweight torpedoes, dropped by helicopters and maritime patrol aircraft, trace their direct lineage to the Mark 24, that Lieutenant Junior Grade John Ballantyne dropped from a TBF Avenger in the North Atlantic in 1943. The guidance principles are more sophisticated now, the sensors more sensitive, the warheads more precisely engineered, but the fundamental concept of a weapon that listens for its target and follows the sound to impact has not changed in 80 years. Centimetric radar. The technology that made U-boat detection receivers useless because they simply could not receive signals at that wavelength became the basis for weather radar air traffic control systems and the microwave communications infrastructure that underlies modern telecommunications. The magnetron cavity that generated centimetric radar signals was considered the most valuable piece of technology transferred between Allied nations during the entire war. American engineers who first examined the British magnetron in 1940 described their reaction as comparable to receiving technology from the future. That future now fills every commercial kitchen as a microwave oven, every airport control tower, every weather station on Earth. The escort carrier concept itself, the idea that small, fast-produced mission-specific carriers could project air power across vast ocean areas more effectively than larger, more expensive alternatives, outlasted the war by decades. During the Korean War, escort carriers flew ground support missions within 18 months of a conflict that began without adequate carrier aviation. During Vietnam, escort carriers operated as helicopter assault platforms, projecting Marines onto beaches using the same fundamental principle Kaiser had argued to Roosevelt in 1941. You don't need the perfect ship, you need enough ships built fast enough to be everywhere at once. Today's amphibious assault ships vessels that carry helicopter squadrons and marine landing forces are direct institutional descendants of the Casablanca class. Navies in 12 countries currently operate vessels built on the escort carrier's core philosophy. The total accounting of what escort carriers prevented, rather than simply what they achieved, is where the numbers become genuinely staggering. In early 1943, Britain had approximately 4 months of oil reserves remaining at projected consumption rates. If the Atlantic supply lines had remained severed at the rate U-boats were achieving in March 1943, 97 ships per month, the arithmetic of British survival became catastrophic before the end of that year. The escort carriers deployed into the mid-Atlantic gap between May and October 1943 and reduced monthly shipping losses by 80% within 6 months. The million-plus troops who crossed the Atlantic for the Normandy invasion in 1944 crossed in ships that operated in an Atlantic that escort carriers had made safe. The invasion that liberated Western Europe was logistically possible because small carriers built by a construction company in California had closed a gap in the ocean that German strategy depended upon remaining open. But the largest lesson from this story has nothing to do with ships or torpedoes or radar frequencies. It is about the specific kind of institutional resistance that greets every genuinely new idea and the specific kind of person who pushes through it anyway. Ingersoll was not stupid. He was not cowardly. He was not malicious. He was a highly intelligent, deeply experienced professional who had spent 40 years learning how naval warfare worked, and when someone proposed doing it differently, his instinct was to evaluate the proposal against the framework his experience had built. By that framework, independent hunter-killer operations with escort carriers were risky, unproven, and doctrinally unsound. He was applying genuine expertise to the question. He was simply applying expertise built for a world that had already changed. This happens in every war. It happens in every industry. The people best positioned to evaluate new ideas are also the people whose accumulated expertise makes genuinely new ideas hardest to recognize. The Wolfpack tactic that devastated Allied convoys from 1940 to 1942 had been considered impossibly complex and tactically unsound by German naval officers who had fought in the First World War. The aircraft carrier itself had been dismissed by battleship admirals who had spent careers learning that naval battles were decided by 16-inch guns. The computer that now coordinates every military operation on Earth was once described by a senior IBM executive as a machine with no conceivable commercial application beyond scientific research. The consistent pattern is not that institutions are wrong and individuals are right. It is that institutions optimize for the world they know, while individuals occasionally see the world that is coming. Gallery saw it. Kaiser saw it. The reserve pilots who flew from pitching decks in North Atlantic gales, using technology that didn't officially exist against submarines that weren't supposed to be there, saw it in the most practical possible way through their bomb sights at 8,000 feet, with their thumbs on the release trigger. And now here is the detail that almost no one knows. The detail that was classified until 1998 and still does not appear in most popular accounts of the Battle of the Atlantic. When U-505 was captured on June 4, 1944, and her Enigma settings and codebooks were secured, the intelligence value was considered so extraordinary and so fragile, dependent entirely on Germany, never learning that the submarine had been taken rather than sunk, that a decision was made at the highest levels of Allied command to falsify the official record. U-505 was listed in German naval records through a deliberate Allied disinformation operation as having been sunk by depth charges with all hands lost. Her 58 surviving crew members were held in a specially constructed isolated compound at a prisoner of war facility in Louisiana, denied all mail contact and any communication with the outside world for the remainder of the war. They knew they were prisoners. They did not know why their isolation was so complete. They could not know that their continued existence, their survival, which they experienced as fortunate, was itself the secret being protected, because a crew confirmed dead cannot report that their submarine was captured intact. For 11 months, those 58 men sat in Louisiana, while Allied intelligence read every German naval communication using settings taken from their submarine. For 11 months, U-boats went to positions that German Naval Command believed were secure, and American escort carrier aircraft were already there waiting. For 11 months, the men whose capture made this possible sat in a Louisiana compound, wondering when the war would end. When it ended in May 1945, they were released and repatriated to Germany. None of them ever publicly discussed what had happened aboard U-505 during those 11 minutes when Lieutenant Albert David went into a flooding submarine alone with scuttling charges armed. Most of them lived ordinary post-war German lives. Harold Lang, their commander, settled in Hamburg and worked in shipping administration. He died in 1967. His obituary did not mention U-505. U-505 herself is in Chicago. She has been on permanent display at the Museum of Science and Industry since 1954, preserved in an indoor climate-controlled facility that has kept her in better condition than most surface ships from the same era. More than 30 million people have walked through her. She is the only German submarine captured on the high seas during the Second World War, the only surviving Type 9 sea boat in the world, and the most visited museum artifact in the city of Chicago. Every year, schoolchildren climb down her hatch into the same spaces where Albert David pulled scuttling charges, with water rising around his boots in the dark, with the clock running, not knowing if he had seconds or minutes or nothing at all. They walk through the torpedo room, where German sailors had lived for weeks at a time. They stand in the control room, where the decision to abandon ship was made, and most of them have no idea that the submarine they are standing inside was the most important intelligence capture of the entire Atlantic War, or that the capture was kept secret for 50 years, or that the men who made it possible went back to being insurance salesmen and farmers and auto mechanics when it was over. From merchant ship hulls to hunter-killer groups that closed the mid-Atlantic gap. From Kaiser's coffins to the instrument that broke the German submarine offensive and made the liberation of Europe logistically possible. 53 U-boats destroyed. 30,000 German sailors killed in the submarine force as a whole. 1 million Allied troops crossing the Atlantic in safety to fight a war that the escort carriers had made winnable. Henry Kaiser promised the impossible and delivered it. Daniel Gallery trained for a mission his superiors said couldn't be done and did it. The reserve pilots flew missions in aircraft from decks in conditions that should have grounded them against enemies with years of combat experience using weapons that officially didn't exist, and they won. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by admirals or battleships or the accumulated wisdom of professional naval tradition. It was won by converted merchant ships built in 10 weeks, crewed by civilians who had something that experience alone cannot provide, the absolute inability to accept that something couldn't be done simply because it had never been done before. That is the only lesson that matters, and it is the one that history keeps having to relearn. If this story moved you, if you know another moment where an impossible idea changed everything, share it in the comments and subscribe, because this is one of hundreds of stories from the Second World War that never made it into the textbooks. The history you weren't taught is always the most important kind. The gray wolves are gone. The escort carriers are museums. But the ocean they fought over belongs to the side that understood first and completely that in modern war, the winner is not the side with the best weapons. It is the side that builds them fastest.